We would like to send out a special thanks to our new sponsor, Wink, for supporting The Trail Went Cold. Wink is offering our audience members who are over 21 and live in the U.S. a $22 credit plus free shipping on their first order of 4 bottles of wine as a new member of Wink. So please visit trywink.com/cold. That's trywinc.com/cold. Thank you and enjoy the show.
May 19th, 2004. New York City. After leaving her apartment, 21-year-old Julliard student Sarah Fox does not return and is found strangled to death in a wooded area at Inwood Hill Park 6 days later. Her nude body is posed in a ritualistic fashion and surrounded by 24 tulip petals. A suspect named Dimitry Sheinman eventually pops up on the radar, claiming that he had visions of Sarah's murder and that she communicates with him from beyond the grave. However, in spite of a cloud of suspicion surrounding Sheinman, no evidence has ever linked him to the crime. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to the latest minisode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Mortar, and today I will be covering a very odd cold case, the 2004 murder of Sarah Fox. As you probably know, I'm always open to receiving suggestions from listeners about mysteries to cover on this podcast, and I particularly love it when they send me compelling cases which I've never even heard of before. Earlier this year, within the same 1-month period, I had 2 separate listeners suggest an unsolved murder I was not familiar with. They were an emailer named Mary Elizabeth and a Twitter follower named Lily, so thanks for the suggestion, you two, because once I delved into this case, there were things about it which made my jaw drop. The circumstances of Sarah Fox's murder are particularly bizarre, but the weirdest element of this story is the prime suspect, an eccentric individual named Dimitry Sheinman, who has constantly inserted himself into the investigation by claiming he's had visions of the crime and conversations with the deceased victim. Quite frankly, this might be one of the most brazen suspects I've ever come across in a murder case, so this minisode is going to examine whether he's actually guilty of the crime or nothing more than an attention speaker. But before we get started, we have an important announcement to make. For the past year, The Trail Went Cold has spent each week alternating between regular full-length episodes and shorter minisodes like this one. However, I'm sure many of you have noticed that our most recent episodes have been longer than usual, so we've decided that today's show will be our last official minisode. Not to worry, we're still going to be providing weekly content as usual, but they're all just going to be labeled as episodes from now on. Some of our episodes will be longer, some of our episodes will be shorter, but the big change is that we're not going to worry so much about alternating between the long ones and the short ones. We'll just simply present you with a new case every week and not worry about the length. Ultimately, the most important thing is getting all the important points about each story out there, regardless of how little or how much time it takes. Anyway, what hasn't changed is that we're available for download on several platforms, including iTunes, Stitcher, and Google Play Music. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review, because that will help spread the word. The Trail Went Cold also has its own PayPal account and a donate button on the website. If there's anyone out there who wants to make a donation, we would greatly appreciate it, and we'll be sure to give you a shout out on a future episode. So with all that out of the way, let us now examine the unsolved murder of Sarah Fox. Our story begins in New York City in 2004. Our central figure is 21-year-old Sarah Fox, who originally hails from Pennsauken, New Jersey. She is currently a third-year drama student at the famous Julliard School and has aspirations of an acting career. Sometime between 4 and 5 p.m. on May 19th, Sarah leaves the apartment she shares in Manhattan with her boyfriend and a roommate. She is dressed in her workout clothes and apparently has plans to go jogging through Inwood Hill Park, which is about 7 to 8 minutes away. Even though Sarah tells her roommate she'll be back soon, she never returns. After she is reported missing, massive searches are conducted throughout the area for Sarah, and 6 days later, a group of volunteers from a search party would find a nude, decomposed body in a heavily wooded area of Inwood Hill Park. The victim was soon identified as Sarah Fox, and the cause of death was determined to be strangulation. Due to the advanced state of decomposition, they were unable to determine if she'd been sexually assaulted. Sarah's portable CD player would later be found about 100 feet from her body. What was particularly strange was that Sarah's body appeared to be deliberately posed in some sort of ritualistic fashion, as she was surrounded by some broken branches and at least 24 yellow petals from a tulip tree. Initially, there was debate about whether the branches and petals might have fallen off some nearby tulip trees or were blown there by the wind, but investigators eventually concluded that they were deliberately placed there in that fashion. A botanist examined one of the flower buds and determined that it seemed fresh enough for the flower to have only been there between 24 to 48 hours before Sarah's body was found. This implied that the killer returned to the scene days after murdering Sarah in order to surround her body with flowers. One sex crime expert speculated that this might have been the perpetrator's twisted attempt to honor their victim as if they were an artist posing a model. Anyway, Sarah's murder sent shockwaves throughout the community and at Julliard. And here's an interesting piece of trivia. In an article published in the Philadelphia Daily News, they interviewed some of Sarah's classmates at Julliard, and one of them talked about a meeting the students had to express their grief. He is quoted as saying, "It was people coming together to grieve and be there for one another. I am pretty distraught about it. We were really good friends." Well, this Julliard student happened to be Oscar Isaac, who eventually went on to great fame acting in such films as Inside Llewyn Davis, Ex Machina, and Star Wars The Force Awakens. In December of that year, the police finally announced that they had a suspect, a 39-year-old Russian immigrant named Dimitry Sheinman. Sheinman first showed up on the radar when people started sharing stories with the police about a quote-unquote creepy guy who liked to walk his dog, a large Rhodesian Ridgeback, through Inwood Hill Park without a leash, and was notorious for picking fights with other dog walkers. Well, when Sheinman was questioned, he said that he was happy to help with the investigation, and then claimed he fell into a trance and had visions of Sarah's murder. But he raised some red flags when he wound up describing specific details about the murder scene which had never been released to the public, such as how a stick had been placed between Sarah's legs, and that one of her ribs was broken. Police took a DNA sample from Sheinman and searched his apartment, where they found a diary containing a description of a dead girl in a park surrounded by flowers, which sounded very similar to Sarah Fox's murder scene. After this, Sheinman was publicly named as the prime suspect and kept under surveillance, but no evidence could be found to implicate him in the crime. However, it was only a few months later when Sheinman was arrested for punching another dog walker in Inwood Hill Park. Sheinman claimed that the other man instigated the fight by calling him a murderer, but he still served 2 months on Rikers Island for assault. After this, Sheinman and his family decided to leave the country and relocated to Cape Town, South Africa. But believe it or not, Sheinman would reignite the investigation years later by putting himself in the spotlight again. In 2012, Sheinman actually returned to New York City, claiming that he was seeking a publisher for a new book he'd written called Is He Friendly?, named after a question he'd commonly get asked when he walked his Rhodesian Ridgeback through Inwood Hill Park. In the book, Sheinman wrote about being considered the prime suspect in Sarah Fox's murder, and that when he tried to help the police with their investigation by sharing his psychic visions with them, they turned him into a scapegoat. Well, Sheinman claimed that he was still experiencing these psychic visions and wanted to assist with the investigation again because he had a vision in which he saw the name of Sarah's real killer. The guy even went so far as to hold a press conference on the steps of the police station to announce that he was going to go inside and hand over a sealed envelope containing all the new details he'd learned about the crime from his visions, including the killer's name. Well, when the police looked into this new information, it turned out that Sheinman did not provide anything useful which wasn't already public knowledge, and the killer he named was a former music instructor from Julliard who had already been interviewed and ruled out as a suspect years earlier. Well, in a surprise turn of events, a new development in the case occurred only 1 month later. The NYPD were looking into an incident at an Occupy Wall Street protest from March of that year, where protesters would chain open the emergency exit gates at subway stations so that people could sneak into the stations and ride the subway for free. DNA testing was performed on one of the chains and entered into a database, and everyone was stunned to discover that it wound up matching DNA from Sarah Fox's CD player. For a brief moment, this led the focus away from Sheinman, since he wouldn't have been in the country when the Occupy Wall Street protest took place, but the whole thing turned out to be nothing more than a false lead, as the DNA actually belonged to a very sloppy lab technician who had handled both pieces of evidence. But this wasn't the last anyone ever heard of Dimitry Sheinman. In 2014, he agreed to an interview with the New York Post and invited them to his home in Cape Town, where he showed them how he kept a photo of Sarah Fox under a glass tabletop. Sheinman claimed that Sarah now communicated with him from beyond the grave and that they frequently had conversations together. In fact, Sarah even told Sheinman that she loved him and encouraged him to clear his name because she wanted the real killer's blood. Well, even though Sheinman continues to maintain his innocence, the NYPD have publicly stated that they still consider him to be the prime suspect. However, they lack conclusive evidence to link Sheinman to the crime, so the murder of Sarah Fox continues to remain unsolved. So I guess you could say, the trail went cold. But before we continue, we would like to take a moment to talk to you about our new sponsor, Wink, as we are very excited that they are fans of the show. We often share some very creepy stories on this podcast, so sipping a nice glass of wine while you listen to us would be a great way to help you relax. Wink is targeting a new generation of wine drinkers who want to do away with the pretense and simply enjoy reasonably priced, great wine. Wink custom tailors wines to the taste of the individual consumer and delivers 3 bottles of wine each month to your doorstep for $39 plus a flat $6 shipping rate. When you visit Wink and take their 20-second palate profile quiz, you'll get instant wine recommendations based on your unique profile. The price point for most wines is $13, so by signing up with Wink, you are getting your first bottle for free. Wink is offering our audience members who are over 21 and live in the US a $20 credit, plus free shipping on your first order of 4 bottles of wine as a new member of Wink. Your wine delivery will be branded Wink. Wink is the wine club associated with Wink. I recently enjoyed a nice 2016 bottle of Chop Shop Cabernet Sauvignon. This wine was produced in California with tasting notes of plum, red cherry, and spice. It has a touch of Petit Verdot and Cabernet Franc, adding some dark, complex nuances to this otherwise juicy Cabernet Sauvignon. What's in the bottle is a friendly red with underlining masculinity and structure that pairs well with your favorite comfort foods. The other night, I drank this alongside some delicious hamburgers I'd cooked up, because Wink's website recommended this after I took their quiz, and they know exactly what they're talking about. Like I said earlier, this particular brand of wine would be an ideal companion for you while listening to our podcast. So to receive a $20 credit and free shipping on 4 bottles of wine on your first order, go to trywink.com/cold. That's trywink.com/cold. trywinc.com/cold. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of this episode. Well, here's a bold statement. At this point, we've covered nearly 80 cases on this podcast, but I think I can safely say that Dimitry Sheinman might be the weirdest person ever featured in any of them. If Sheinman actually committed this murder, then this has got to be one of the most brazen examples of a guilty suspect inserting themselves into an investigation I've ever seen. What kind of person, when they are suspected of killing someone, not only claims to be communicating with them in the afterlife, but then goes so far as to say that the victim told him she loves him? When you look at the circumstances of how Sheinman showed up on the radar, he pretty much created all the suspicion himself. Remember, the reason he was questioned in the first place was because witnesses told the police about this creepy guy who liked to frequent Inwood Hill Park and pick fights with people, but there was nothing to link him to the crime until Sheinman started talking about having visions of the murder and shared incriminating details which weren't public knowledge. If Sheinman hadn't have done that, he might have slipped off the radar without a second thought. And to top it all off, after he leaves the country and moves thousands of miles away, and the investigation reaches a complete standstill, Sheinman then returns to New York and puts himself back into the spotlight again by announcing that he knows who the real killer is and handing this information over to the police, which of course turned out to be completely bogus. You really just have to read that New York Post interview with Sheinman to see how out there he really is. In addition to all his nonsense about communicating with Sarah, here's an example of the kind of off-the-wall quotes he provides in this article. "I don't regret what's happened to me, these crazy events, all this injustice. It made me happen. I was reborn. I hate what is evil in you. I hate it. And I hate what is evil in me. Just as I love what is good in you. I love what is good in me. Anger is impotent, and the hatred of evil is potent." I'm not going to share the URL, but if you search hard enough, you'll find a website Sheinman maintains about a new religion he apparently created for himself, called The Power. But fair warning, this site contains so much incoherent gibberish that your brain will explode if you spend more than 5 seconds there. All that being said, I have to remain objective here, and acknowledge that Sheinman's bizarre behavior does not necessarily prove he committed this crime. The fact of the matter is that Sarah Fox's mother has gone on record as saying that she's never been totally convinced that Sheinman had anything to do with her daughter's death, and mentioned that the media accounts of the case often had varying, conflicting information, and that is a valid point. Apparently, while Sheinman has shared details about the murder scene which turned out to be accurate, he has also apparently shared details which were not. Sheinman said he had a vision of Sarah's clothing neatly piled up near her body with a tampon on top, but because of conflicting information in different articles, I'm not 100% sure if this part of his vision is true. It appears that the two pieces of info Sheinman did share with police which seemed to incriminate him were the stick being placed between Sarah's legs and one of her ribs being broken, as this info was not supposed to be public knowledge. However, remember that Philadelphia Daily News article I mentioned earlier, containing the quote from Oscar Isaac? It was published on May 27, 2004, and it actually mentions Sarah's broken rib, so it looks like that tidbit did leak out after all. So theoretically, Sheinman could have read about it somewhere before he mentioned it to the police, which is one of the reasons Sarah's mother is not 100% convinced he did it. Regardless, to the police's credit, even though they believe Sheinman is the perpetrator, this has not stopped them from pursuing other potential leads. In 2013, they announced that they were performing forensic tests to investigate 2 other potential suspects in the case who weren't Sheinman, but it doesn't look like this went anywhere. I will say, however, that the false lead about the DNA evidence from the Occupy Wall Street protest has always struck me as pretty weird. Just 1 month after Sheinman makes headlines again by returning to New York and contacting the police, they managed to match DNA from the chain on a subway station door to DNA from Sarah's CD player. Of course, it was only about a day or so before they announced that this was just a mistake involving a sloppy lab technician, but the one question I've always had is, why were they performing DNA testing on this chain to begin with? I know that crime labs are always dealing with massive backlogs of evidence to test in unsolved cold cases, so it doesn't strike me as the best use of resources to test a chain which was used to commit the capital crime of allowing people to sneak into a subway station without paying. I know representatives from Occupy Wall Street thought this might be a deliberate attempt by the NYPD to discredit them by accidentally linking them to an unsolved murder, but I doubt this situation was nothing more than simple incompetence. All that being said, this error could almost be considered a blessing in disguise, because if Sheinman was charged with the murder, and his DNA did not match the DNA on the CD player, the case against him might have fallen apart. However, because of the mix-up with the chain, we now know that the DNA on the CD player belongs to a lab technician and not the actual killer. When he was originally questioned, Sheinman did submit a DNA sample to the police, but it sounds like there just isn't enough strong forensic evidence from the murder scene to conclusively match or exclude him. Remember, Sarah's body was in such an advanced state of decomposition that they were unable to determine if she was sexually assaulted. So if police want to prosecute Sheinman, they will probably have to turn up some other evidence in order to make a case. But the big question is Sheinman actually the perpetrator, or is he nothing more than an attention-seeking glory hound? It's true that people will sometimes insert themselves into murder investigations, even if they had nothing to do with the crime. But on the other hand, there are some people who are so narcissistic that if they manage to get away with a crime, it drives them nuts when they can't tell anyone about it, so they'll find ways to make themselves the center of attention, even if there's a major risk of getting caught. This is why you hear so many stories of cases being solved because the perpetrator flat out bragged about committing the crime to someone else. It seems very likely that Sarah was attacked by someone while she was jogging through Inwood Hill Park, who abducted her and dragged her body into the woods to kill her. Sarah was known to frequently jog through that park, and we know that Sheinman walked his dog there all the time, so if they crossed paths on a previous occasion, Sheinman could have set his sights on her. But it's also possible that Sarah was the random victim of a spur-of-the-moment attack, either by Sheinman or someone else. Of course, the weirdest aspect of her murder scene is undoubtedly the 24 tulip petals surrounding her body. If the analysis from the botanist was correct, and those flowers were only there about 24 to 48 hours before Sarah's body was discovered, then that means the killer returned to the scene to place them there, which is a pretty risky thing to do, especially since search parties were checking the park for Sarah that entire week. If Sarah was just the victim of a random attack by some sexual predator, then I'm not so sure they would go to the trouble of returning to the murder scene to do all that stuff. But when you look at Dimitry Sheinman's behavior these past several years, he totally strikes me as the type of guy who would do something like that. Remember, a sex crime expert stated that the flowers surrounding Sarah's body might have been the perpetrator's strange attempt to honor his victim. And guilty or innocent, one thing about Sheinman which cannot be disputed is that he has a very unhealthy obsession with Sarah Fox. I mean, this guy invited the New York Post into his home to show them a photo of Sarah under a glass tabletop, even though if he was truly innocent of this crime, he technically never would have even met her. Sheinman is married and has a family of his own, yet he's sharing stories about how this murder victim is expressing love for him from beyond the grave, and it's so damn creepy. I'm not kidding, this is an actual quote he used in his interview. "Sometimes I walk by and she winks at me, you know. And she knows, I know exactly what you're doing, and I love you." If he's guilty, you almost get the sense that Sheinman is putting Sarah on a pedestal because he's got some sort of subconscious guilt about being responsible for her death, or maybe he just secretly wants to get caught. I can't get over the fact that Sheinman was safely living a new life in South Africa, but then willingly traveled back to New York in 2012. Now, the United States does have an extradition treaty with South Africa, and would be able to have Sheinman arrested and extradited if evidence ever surfaced to implicate him in the crime. But returning to the scene of the murder, initiating contact with the police and the media, and even going so far as to call a press conference at the police station is the type of brazenness which can really light a fire under investigators who would have a much easier time arresting Sheinman if he was in the US. So in the end, there are pretty much 3 scenarios which explain Sheinman's actions. He's a glory hound who loves to make himself the center of attention in murder cases he had nothing to do with. He is mentally ill and genuinely does believe he's had conversations with Sarah Fox and visions of her murder, or he committed the crime, but he is either incredibly narcissistic or so ridden with guilt that he just cannot keep a low profile and is practically daring the cops to arrest him. When you look at the situation as a whole, I'd say the 3rd scenario is definitely the most likely one. So yes, the authorities are certain Sheinman did it, but the problem is that the evidence just isn't there, and I think he knows this. It seems there isn't enough strong physical evidence to make a DNA match, and while it's suspicious that Sheinman supposedly shared details about the murder scene that weren't public knowledge, that in itself isn't enough to build a case against him in court. I think the best option for solving this case might be if anyone out there who happened to see or hear anything incriminating decides to come forward. In fact, if there's anyone out there with evidence pointing to another suspect besides Sheinman, that would be good too. From everything I read about Sarah Fox, She seemed like a pretty special young woman who was beloved by everyone who knew her, so she definitely deserves justice, most especially if the person who murdered her also happens to be the same person spouting garbage about her loving him from the afterlife. So if you have any information about the unsolved murder of Sarah Fox, or should I say if you have any useful information about the murder and your name is not Dimitry Sheinman, please contact the NYPD Crime Stoppers at 1-800-577-TIPS, which is 1-800-577-8477. Or if you just have your own theory about what happened, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email at robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. So I just wanted to give a shout out to my supporters at the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit and the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum. We also have a couple new donors this week, and they are Andrew, Hannah, Marnix, and Catherine. So thank you very much, guys. I need to provide my thanks to Miguel Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, or leave us a rating or review on iTunes, Stitcher, or Google Play Music. We also have a new private Facebook discussion group for The Trail Went Cold, so if you want to discuss the podcast or its featured cases with myself or your fellow listeners, feel free to join at any time, and I'll approve your entry ASAP. And just a few weeks ago, The Trail Went Cold finally opened its own online store where you can purchase official merchandise for the podcast, such as t-shirts, mugs, and stickers. Just visit our website, trailwentcold.com, and click on our store button, and with the holidays rapidly approaching, Trail Went Cold merch would make a great Christmas present for all true crime and unsolved mysteries buffs. And like I mentioned earlier, we also have a donate button on our website, so if you're feeling generous and want to express your appreciation for all the hard work we put into this podcast, we'd be extremely grateful. Anyway, thank you so much for listening to our final minisode and all of our minisodes prior to this, and we hope you continue to enjoy our content. So have yourself a good week, and join me next Wednesday for a brand new episode of The Trail Went Cold.